Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It is with a pleasure and an honor to introduce you to Dr. Daren Graves. He is a professor of education at Simmons University, where his research lies in the intersection of critical race theory, racial identity development, and teacher education. His work has been published in many academic journals, including Developmental Psychology, Applied Developmental Science, and the Youth and Society. Daren has supported the SCE with our statewide school discipline collaborative and facilitated a platform for students' voice. He also co-teaches critical race theory in education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Additionally, he co-authored the critical acclaimed book with Scott Sider called Schooling for Critical Consciousness, Engaging Black and Latinx Youth in Analyzing, Navigating, and Challenging Racial Injustice, which will be addressed today. And I highly recommend the read. Welcome, Dr. Graves.
Well, thanks so much, Kim. I really appreciate it. Much love to all of y'all for showing up today. Much love to all of you who are, working with young folks and educators. It's been, an amazingly tough year. And so it's always an honor to work with educators, and even more so now, given what we've had to go through over these last year and a half, and what we're going to have to continue to go through. So thank you very much. I am going to share my screen. I'll start with that, why not? And let me just do it from the beginning. So I'm gonna talk, I would suggest, if you have the opportunity, Scott Sider and myself, we're gonna get a chance to give a keynote at the end. So that'll be a chance for us to tie a bunch of what we're gonna be talking about together. Scott is also giving another presentation as we speak. I would highly suggest, if you have the flexibility, maybe the next time during the next session, to go to that one, because I think these two very much complement each other. Scott is going to be talking a lot more in his breakout work session about some of the key findings we had from our book around schooling for critical consciousness, and really focusing on the kind of curricular work that educators should be doing to really help get our students engaged academically, civically, and otherwise. I'm going to talk in this presentation today, and get y'all talking to each other, about some of the work that educators need to do in terms of thinking about their own identities, thinking about the kind of authority they're building with their students, the kind of relationships they need to build with their students and communities, to be able to situate themselves and their students to do that curricular work. I hope that makes sense, right? Some of the work is going to be curricular and trying to figure out what are we going to do in our classrooms to position our students, and some of it is how do we position ourselves as educators so that the students can actually receive receive the teaching that comes with the curricular work. So that's what we're going to be talking about here for the next few minutes or so. So please bear with me. Let me see. And I'm going to get us at least two opportunities for folks to get into breakouts and talk to each other for a little bit. Okay. So let's see. Let me move to the next slide. So here we are. I'm going to get you into breakout groups in a second. I want you to just think of a time when an educational experience that you had, whether it was at a formal or an informal setting, that helped you see the world in a new way, right? Take a few minutes to just share what you learned, how you learned it, what made it so powerful, okay? Let me stop sharing for a second, okay? And I will put this question in the chat so that everybody can hold on to it as they move into groups, which I think I just did right now. And I'm doing this just randomly. So I'm gonna put folks into groups of I'll do groups of 2 to 3, okay? And you'll get and let me see if I can do the, how do I make sure? Anyway, all right, here we go. Create. I'm gonna give y'all about 8 minutes to do this, okay? So there's that. And I'm gonna open all the rooms. So here we go. I'll see y'all in about 8 minutes, okay? All right. Looks like we have everyone coming back from the breakouts. Never enough time. Always hate to break it up. Sorry for tried to get everybody in there into a group. I know some people might have joined at the last minute. Sorry about that. We want to make sure we gave you at least the opportunity to get into a group. But I'd love it if maybe like one or two folks could just share out if they'd be so inclined. What they shared in their small group, and I would invite folks to. I definitely would love to have someone share, in the large group, but also if you want to, on this, in the Zoom call, or you want to share in the chat, that works as well. But I just want to hold some space to have somebody share out with us.
So I don't mind sharing out.
Oh, thank you.
I left off a piece of my story. That's why I'm offering to share out. Anyway, so I was telling them that I came from the Bronx. I worked there for a long time, very diverse, different cultures. And I didn't really run into the white-black racism because there was hardly any white people there. We were all, all from different places. When I came here to Bridgeport to work, there was this really eccentric teacher. I sort of liked her. I found her, sort of amusing. I was telling them, and she was a little strange. And one day she called me girly, and I said, girly, wow. I knew the term, and I knew it was really kind of sort of derogatory, maybe kind of old school, old fashioned, but I was telling them I wasn't offended by it. I was more curious as to why she would use that term, knowing the connotation. And then I said to myself, well, she probably doesn't know, which is what the case was. She did not know the connotation for that term. So I was saying, sometimes we hear these things, and sometimes people are just ignorant of their language. And it's not that they're bad people, or that they're racist people, or that, they're trying to say, make you feel less than what you are. It's just that they don't know. And it's good at those points when you call them on it and say, hey, that's not really a good term to use a different term. And the reason I say that, it changed the way I looked at things. I usually take every situation as it comes to me. I went to a foreign country once, and we were there to look at schools. And that particular country had been homogenous for the most part until they had an influx of Somalians. So now when we were engaging with the principal of one of the schools, she used the term, I'm not sure how the students are because they all look alike. So several of my colleagues were offended by that. But because of the experience I had, I wasn't offended by it. I just took it to say, okay, so she doesn't realize that's a little bit, that's not something we would say that they all look alike, because they don't all look alike. So anyway, so that was my story.
Thanks for sharing, Selena. I appreciate it. Maybe get one more person to share.
Well, I don't mind sharing.
Thank you.
So what I was struck by, I think, in all three of the stories that we shared, was that each of us related to a real life experience. And it kind of it sort of just made me think, how do we generate that instructionally through our classrooms without putting our students through either that kind of real life epiphany? Because in some ways, much like the last story we just heard, you could be hurting or causing harm to others. And even though you might be learning through it, at the same time, like, I would rather kind of preempt that so my kids don't actually end up causing that hurt and harm. But when do we do that in the classroom when it's not always necessarily like a real life, authentic, in the moment experience? But yeah, that's what all of us sort of shared, that same kind of lived, moment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for the sharing. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that the folks who shared, and then they got in the large group and the small group are really, because I think I want us to sort of for us, this would be a jumping off point for our conversation, right? Thinking about, how can we as adults kind of really building off your point, Jennifer, right? Like, how can we as adults, like, sort of position ourselves to like have those kind of revelatory kind of learning moments, like, in the classroom, right? And so, and I think there's some, there's definitely utility from the outside of the classroom learning as well, but there's something useful about the inside the learning, right? Because we can like scaffold the situation, right? And it can become a more conducive learning moment when we sort of are intentionally trying to set it up, right? As opposed to, was that it often happens for us, like in Selena's story, right, where we're just out in the world and we get hit by, you know, whatever comes at us. So let me go back and share my screen. Thanks y'all so much for sharing. Let me keep going. So I just want to acknowledge that, you know, some of, you know, what my journey in terms of having like this kind of educational journey that helped me see the world in a new way, it was sort of built on the foundation of my parents, right? And this is actually my picture of this is my dad over here on the far left. And some of his colleagues, and my mom was involved too. That's where they met at college, at Swarthmore College. And this is them basically taking over the president's office to help to compel the college to have, I think it was an AFAM studies department. And so I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of folks who have already set me up, right, to see the world in ways that that sort of push back against the world that might be set up for me to see, right, or set up for me, or the world that I'm spoon-fed to, right? So as we think about building, you know, this kind of awareness and the abilities for young folks to make sense of the world and do something about it, you know, schools are going to be an important piece in that. And we also need to acknowledge that there are ways that their families, right, and are also part of that process, right? And there's been a legacy and histories of different communities engaged in this kind of work that our children are a part of. So we need to understand that we're not going to necessarily be the sole providers, right, of this kind of information and that motivation, and then we need to be partnering and with families and communities as we think about this. For me, this is a picture of me on the left. So those of you who don't know, I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, which was a very interesting place for a young Black man to grow up in. You know, it's a very affluent white town. I went to Greenwich High School. That's a picture of me. It's one of my yearbook pictures. And so, you know, I think that it was around like 10th or 11th grade that I had a real sort of big school experience that really changed me, right? One of them was on the bottom, I have the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was a contribution of my parents, and my parents were really, again, trying to help me supplement the learning that I was or wasn't getting in school, by encouraging me to do, you know, work at home and outside of school, to educate myself. And the autobiography of Malcolm X was just a massive moment for me, because, you know, I think even Dr. Williams talked about it earlier. Just there's so many gems in the book about growth and change and and his relationship to education and what it could be and what it should be. You know, that really helped orient myself as a Black person, right, in the country. But then also in I think it was in 10th grade, my high school social studies class, which was like an American history class, and this was taught by a white man, right? I had the experience of him. We got the traditional American history school text, and then he also paired it with People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which is my first time I ever had, like, you know, experience. And that experience to me was mind blowing. It was like revelatory. It was very powerful to me to see, in, you know, him pairing this text, right, with the traditional history text, right. It blew up the sense of a world that was sort of spoon fed to me, right. And more importantly than that, it helped me realize the danger of the single story, right? The danger of seeing things through one lens, right? And the utility, right, of seeing the world and people's experiences through multiple lenses, right? And it was really, I think those two texts, and I think I'm mentioning the Howard Zinn one in particular because it was more of a school-based thing for me. That introduction of that text paired with my traditional history text was a moment within school for me that awoke, that just, it was an awakening for me, right? It was like, wow, okay. I think it was the real beginning, at least in terms of within the walls of my school, like my critical thinking journey, okay? And I really appreciate the way that Dr. Williams was talking about the notion of critical thinking and how important of a skill that is, right? And I think that way of seeing the world, right? Seeing the danger of that single story really launched me, later on to graduate from college and then eventually become an educator and go back into schools, right? To help, young folks who look like me have the opportunities that I was given by virtue of my education, right? But I think that whole journey was sparked by this critical thinking journey by this teacher. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think that's what we want to be, those teachers. I think we want to be those teachers for our students, right? We want to be the ones who help them, whether it's through social studies or math or science or whatever it is, help our students see the world in a new way. And I think in particular in this case, it helped me understand the ways that power and privilege work both historically up through the contemporary, right? And as I think to build on all the topics, especially the topic that Dr. Williams was talking about earlier, that's the kind of journey that I'm thinking about helping our students figure out and navigate moving forward. We're also way overdue for reimagining of school, okay? So I always talk about how we have sort of a 19th century schedule and preparing students for 20th century jobs in our 21st century schools right now, right? We need to reimagine what schools are for and what they should look like, right? We're about 21 years overdue for that. I think the pandemic, right, really, I think I'm hearing some other folks. I might try and mute people if I can. I see, sorry. The pandemic moment, right, really sort of catapulted this conversation, right? Because then when we had to do the virtual learning, we really had to do a lot of thinking about what do we keep, what goes, what do we need, what does school really need to be for, right? Both in terms of the ways that we shifted to virtual, but also just because of the context, that's going on around our young folks, right? What do they need to learn? What do they need to know, right? So that we don't reproduce some of the social ills we're seeing in our society. So this is my way of saying the ways that we do school, whether that's curricularly, and in this case, I'm talking about in terms of how we as educators orient ourselves to our students, needs to change. We're overdue for that reimagination. And this moment, both the COVID moment and the racial reckoning and the moment, I think has really catapulted us into a space to really think about how we need to be doing school differently. So I think we should have been done this already, but the times now are really calling for it. I was so thrilled with Dr. Williams. If y'all can get a chance to see it, but I hope you did, but I was really thrilled with Dr. Williams's keynote earlier today, because I think it speaks to a lot of what I'm talking about, what I'm going to talk about, at least in the first part of this presentation, right? That, in general, schooling has sort of three kinds of purposes. It has social purposes, right? Some of those purposes are around, right? Social purposes would be helping socialize young students into ways of being that are deemed accessible, acceptable by the community, those kind of things writ large, right? It has economic purposes, right? Preparing students, to become, productive members of the workforce, right? And also political purposes, right? We make kids go to school, right? And part of the reason we do that is because we want to have students, we want to, induce our young folks into the society so they can be active civic engagers of our society, right? So all three of these things are part of the purposes of schooling. Now, I think what's probably happened as we've been moving into the 21st century, at least in the United States, as you can see from my graphic, is I think that the weight that we are collectively giving to these purposes has become a little warped, or a lot warped in schools, okay? And that, I think the economic purposes of schooling have really taken over, right? In other words, that, the forces that are really interested in making sure that we have, a productive workforce, I think are the forces in education, both locally and especially nationally, right? And then the state levels, who are really driving the education sort of reform movement, if you will, right? And so I think that's taken up, an oversized portion of our energy. And that's also come through in the form of, our high stakes testing and other things, right? we've been giving more attention, although not enough, to some of the social purposes. And I think, right, that has come through in the form of our renewed, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in not so good ways, focus on social and emotional learning that we're seeing these days, which I think is definitely necessary and important. But I do think the political purposes of education has been losing ground in this in this regard, right? And we've been spending less and less time thinking about some of those purposes. How do we create? How are we going to position young folks to be active engagers of civically and otherwise? Okay. And so let me just say this notion of, and I know that sometimes when we think about education as political, like that is kind of like a scary thing, or a fraught kind of way of thinking about it. And I would say that, to me, education is inherently political. Okay. Now, if we're talking about education being partisan, now that is a problem. I can see that. I can wrap my head around that, right? Wait, I don't think necessarily that education needs to be a place to like engage in the battles of partisan politics. I can understand that, right? But to me, to make education, not political at all seems impossible, right? Even if just because, like I said, one of the main, we make students go to school, right? By law, right? And one of the reasons we do that is so that we can make sure that we have an informed, voting base, right? And so that's just the simplest way to think about, why education is inherently political. But we have so many histories, right? We have, the first and the third pictures here, moving from left to right, are Mary McLeod Bethune and Carter G. Woodson, right? They have their legacies have shown us the ways in which, access to schooling, the quality of schooling, why we do education, right, is inherently tied to affirming, the humanity of, people, including Black women and women in particular. When we think of Mary McLeod Bethune, right, and part of the ways in which we meet those ideals that Dr. Williams, or try to meet those ideas that Dr. Williams was talking about earlier today, right? So in that regard, we have a legacy of education being inherently political. And the second picture is Thomas Dewey down here. So even if you're just a person who believes, John Dewey down here, who is sort of, he's like the educational godfather of American education. And he argues that education is political, and that the sense is that schooling needs to be, a process in which we don't just fill kids with our own information, but one in which we position them, again, to become the future leaders of a hopefully vibrant democracy, right? And then the last picture here on the bottom right is Paulo Freire, right, who basically asserts, and we'll talk more about this in other presentations, but Paulo Freire basically says that education needs to be political, right? It needs to be the ways in which we equip those of us in our society who are least empowered to be able to disrupt the systems that keep rendering them disempowered, right? And so this is just a long-winded way of saying that we, no matter where you are coming at this schooling or education process from a philosophical perspective, I can't see it being divorced from the political realms, right? So when we do education, we're involved in the political. So I think we can't avoid that. Again, I thought Dr. Williams did a great job of talking about the ways in which we can distinguish the political from the partisan, and he did a great job, I think, of articulating how we can achieve the rightful political goals of American education without entering the fray of political ping pong, if you will, right? And I think the shift away from the political purposes in our schooling is showing up majorly today, right? Like, I really do. I really think that as I see the problems that we're dealing with in our society, whether it's the ways in which, we as adults, forget the children, adults, right, are struggling with thinking about how to, figure out what information we're getting is real or not, right? And ways in which there are people out there who are intentionally trying to misinform, large segments of the population, right? And so I think the shift away from that has left us ill-equipped to think about how to deal with that as adults, right? Individually or collectively. I think it's led, and of course that has led to various forms of activism and action, right? A lot of which is dangerous, insurrection being an example, right? That is really ripping at the very threads of our society, right? And I think it's also, the bottom left-hand corner here, I think it's also leading to a sentiment that devalues schools and teachers, right? And sees them as just like these replaceable cogs that are just there to, inject our students with skills so they can get, jobs. And I think it's really creating scenarios where, teachers are being, are very under-resourced and being pushed to the point of trying to like reassert, the utility of their profession in the first place, right? In the forms of having to go on strike and other things to make sure that not to get like major, things, but really to get basic things for themselves and their students. And I think and I also think the shift away from these political purposes has sort of fueled some of the, I think Dr. Williams did a great job of talking about this morning, some of the debates around whether we should even be talking about issues of race, racism, et cetera, in schools, right? And again, I think Dr. Williams did a really good job of stating that that bringing up these issues is not a function of trying to shame and guilt and punish people, who might be perpetrators of some of these systems, but rather to help position our young folks to be able to do something about it, right? And we'll talk about this more, especially in the keynote, but our goal is not to like shame people away and say, look at you, you're white, you're irredeemable, go away. Like that's quite the opposite of what we're trying to do, okay? Quite the opposite. We need all people on board to make this, to make this stuff go away. Like that's just what it comes down to, okay? And I think a shift back towards the political purposes, right? I think we'll position ourselves and most importantly, our students, right? To be actively engaged in our communities and our society in all the ways that we want them to, okay? Right, I think a lot of us are, place a lot, and I know, I'm sure people in this room feel this way too, right? Place a lot of hope in our young folks to really be the ones who are gonna change the future, right? Change our society for the better. I am one of those people, okay? Right, I am one of those people. And I think there's ways in which we can try and do that. We can do some magical thinking about that, right? We need to actually do the work to position our young folks to do that, to be able to be actively engaged, whether it's within their school communities, outside in the streets, out in the communities, working with intergenerational communities. We have work to do to position them to do that. And I just love this quote from Baldwin. This is from his famous talk to teachers. He says, the whole process of education, I'm sorry, I can't even read it because there's so many windows in front of me. The whole process of education occurs within a social framework and is designed to perpetuate the aims of society. The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which one becomes educated, right? And so Baldwin, he sheds light on this paradox of education, of schooling, right? That on the one hand, schooling is there to reproduce a lot of social values and norms, right? And on the other hand, it can and should be a place, right, to disrupt some of those norms as well, right? And so this is the kind of paradox that we have to balance as educators and students have to do as well, right? And so I think that really leaves us. And by the way, young folks are learning about these issues whether we like it or not, right? They're being bombarded, right? So to those of us who are like, I don't want my kids learning about this, I want my kids, right? They are learning about it. They're learning about it from the media they're consuming, right? They're learning about it from the adult conversations around them. And most importantly, without adult intervention, they're learning about it from each other, okay? So we need to be a part of that conversation. And so as educators, we need to really, and I'm running out of time here, but I want to keep this going. We need to think about what are the societal values or features that we would like to socialize our students into through school. So I'm saying that, remember that paradox. Some things we want to socialize some folks into, and sometimes some ways we want to use school to blow up some of those values, right? And so we got to think for ourselves about the kinds of values that we're trying to reproduce through schools, and that we should be trying to reproduce through schools. And what are the values that we're trying to explicitly position students to disrupt through school? So we need to be really clear amongst ourselves as educators what we're trying to do in those regards. What are we trying to keep going, and what are we trying to blow up through the schooling of the education of our students? I'm going to show us a movie clip. I'm running out of time, but I think this will be worth it. Here we go. This is going to be an example of, and this is from Precious Knowledge. It's a wonderful movie. I can tell you more about it, but I want to show you a clip now. And this will be an opportunity to see the kinds of relationships that educators can forge with their students that I'm trying to model. Okay, so let me just do this. Boom, share, play, large screen. Come on. Let's go.
There's different staffs that come from different pueblos and different nations and different communities from the entire continent, the entire hemisphere. And this one represents Tucson. Despite everything that has happened, everything that has changed, everything that has evolved, we continue to hold our ceremonial staffs to try to maintain and preserve our traditional ways of life of the Mexicano. You hear a lot of talk about La Conquista de Mexico. Well, guess what? It never happened, right? This is proof of that.
They try to teach you that our peoples were ignorant, illiterate, savages, cannibals, sacrifice, all this stuff. They teach you to think that we're somehow, we don't belong here, or that maybe we're part of a new culture or something, that we're brand new, that we just got here. Well, I'm here to tell you that your culture is at least 7,000 years old. Let's go. In Lakesh, tú eres mi otro yo. You are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, I love and respect myself.
There's so many rules at a school. There's rules of classroom rules, there's code of conduct at a school rules, there's district rules. So those are my rules. They're not really rules. They're a way of living.
We must vigorously search within ourselves by silencing the distractions and obstacles in our lives in order to be warriors for our gente and justice. Quetzalcoatl, precious and beautiful knowledge, gaining perspective on events and experiences our ancestors endured, allows us to become more fully realized human beings.
At first, I really didn't accept it. I didn't accept, like, just the posters up on the wall. I didn't know what most of them meant.
Now, this is the 4 Tezcalipocas, or the Nahualin, the 4 movements of being a good human being. It comes from Central Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Toltecs. Tezcalipoca is critical reflection. Anytime something happens to you, you have to ask yourself, how am I at fault? Only through reflection and reconciliation, forgiveness. If you hate your dad, you are hating yourself. But by forgiving your father, who else do you forgive?
Yourself.
Yourself, and now you become whole. Now we can create positive change.
What they show us, how they teach us, it's really different from regular classes. It means knowing where you came from, who you are inside. It really got to my emotions too.
From there, you have this precious knowledge. What do you need to do? Take action. Huitzilopochtli. Positive action. When someone's being made fun of, don't sit there and be quiet. Take positive action. Raul, That was messed up, man. You shouldn't be saying that. I'm not cool with that. Through reflection, reconciliation, stability as a human, action, a new world, a new person.
If you can narrow down what we advocate for, it's the idea of love. It's not simply a love for myself, the love for those around me. How can I change the world for the better? And what this idea of social justice pedagogy asks us to do is to seek the root of the truth. And in that truth, there is greater justice.
European Americans make up 70% of the US population, right? What percentage do you think they're doing time? 30? 31%.
I teach American government with a social justice perspective. This class is based on critical thinking. Students are often taught to read the word, and Paulo Freire said, you have to teach students to read the world. And in order to make change, you have to look at the structure, the institution.
African Americans make up 12% of the population, right? Yet they make up what percent of the jail population? 41%.
Wow.
There is a bias in this system. Now, can we create change with the system? Yes, we can.
What they started teaching us was so interesting. I just could not stop thinking about it. I would go home with articles and I would just read them over and over again. So now that I'm learning more, it's becoming more important to me. I started getting A's and B's.
They passed a rule. They raised the standards. What did this African American coach do? He walked off the court. No pass, no play. It doesn't only affect minorities. It affects poor white kids. Who can explain how that happens?
The policy is not asking you to have an A, it's just asking you to pass. And everyone should pass their classes.
I still think
hold on.
I think every athlete should be able to push themselves. If you're white, black, Mexican, anybody, if you're rich or poor, it's not classes at all.
It's exactly what he said. It depends how dedicated you are.
It's not about, you keep saying if you're dedicated, you can do it. If you're dedicated, you can do it. If it's all on the individual, you don't have a 4.0, then are you not dedicated? It's kind of like saying, if I run fast enough, I can fly. It's not gonna happen. There's something in place that's stopping them from achieving their goals. It's not to say that some people won't break past that and somehow do it, but what's the likelihood of that?
Monitor the way you think. When you start looking and blaming the person, that's a naive consciousness.
Everybody take out So Far From God, because we're going to read a little bit today. My class is the literature component, and it's called Latino literature. Why do we think this is a church? Why do you think this is a Catholic church, just from the cover?
Because it looks like it's in Mexico.
A church in Mexico. Southwest, even better. This looks like home, right? This looks like where you from. It's a Chicano novel, right? I just want to give you a little taste of what you're in. You are in a world called magical realism, okay? And it is a little bit different than fantasy. Because, when you go to Lord of the Rings, everything's magical. When you go to Wizard of Oz, everything's magical. But in here, it's like, I got dumped by my novio, and now my sister's flying to the top of the roof. Now, why does that make sense for our gente? Why did it make sense that Latin America was the place where this happened?
I think it's something really big for me because I had the opportunity with Raza Studies to understand my cultura.
You have a big reading to do.
I was always the quiet girl in the back that I don't want to talk. I don't know what this is about. I'm scared to talk. One of the Mexicans sitting in the back, just sitting there, well, he tends to teach us how to express ourselves so we could have that confidence.
The topics are environment, economic, and dehumanization. Analyze it as a group and see why we put it in that.
Ever since she studied these Raza study classes, oh my God, it's made such big of a change. Her junior year, when she started those classes, it just completely changed.
She was not an empowered Chicana of the 21st century. She walked in here. And she certainly is now. Cool? Does that make some sense? What's this? Oh, is that for their thing? Oh, that's cool. With the tough kids, the ones with the thicker shells, you honor that they come to your
classroom. And I know a lot of teachers are hesitant to use the word fun or entertaining, but I'm sorry. I'm going to use the gifts that I have, and if I can make them laugh, I'm going to make them laugh.
Some say the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. I say the darker the flesh, the deeper the roots. Juice and roots are not true, it's not true rhyme. The slant rhyme allows you to have more freedom because back in the day when hip hop was starting, it was all true rhyme, right? It's like, you know, like we be cool, we go to school, we're gonna go swim in the pool. You know, all that Fat Boys kind of stuff. Yeah. It was like that. Wasn't it like that? It was like that. It was pretty cheesy.
I mean, really, how many teachers do you meet like that?
So then, yeah, it's like tricky and stuff, right?
Just to have them like down and like dancing in class and like throwing jokes and making fun of you, you start getting used to it. You're like, okay, this is him, this is his personality. You know, he does this so he can connect with you on a level. That way you guys can just... I just feel comfortable here, you know. It's like a second home, I guess you could say. I mean, I hate it when I can't be here.
I fell in love with the classes because we learned so much.
In every other class, I mean, you're just thinking about, oh, let's get this work done.
By the book, by the book, by the book, by the book.
But in this class, like, there's meaning to that work.
Let's get to work. Roll up your sleeves, and it's time to work.
They expect more from you. They challenge us more. They challenge me more.
I've never pulled an all-nighter for any other class.
Because now I'm writing about something that I actually care about. I get to choose the subject I want to write about.
Who should have a say?
We should!
You should have a say, absolutely. Look, say it loud, exactly. Exactly.
It's something I need to do for my gente and my ancestors and me.
Are schools part of the community or is the community part of the school? We choose the latter. Our communities need to be part of the school.
My colleagues and I, we're like a family. And then our students, as they come through, are very much like a family. So if they're family, then obviously your family.
Hey, what's up? How are you doing? Good, 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 good. I'm glad you made it. Is everyone else here?
You want to meet my mom?
Yeah, sure. Love to meet your mom, yeah.
You're his favorite teacher.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
He has nothing but very good things to say about you.
Well, thank you.
He talks nonstop.
Is that right?
My parent told me, she says, Doc, you know what? In the previous 11 years of my son's education, never did he come home and talk to me about what he was learning in school. I can't get him to shut up about this stuff.
I'm gonna stop sharing for right now. Sorry, I'm running out of time here. But this. I'll put the link before I forget into the chat. It's from a movie called Precious Knowledge. It's about the ethnic studies program in Tucson. So that's what that is. But let me just go back to my PowerPoint here. So a few things that I wanted you to just I'm not going to send you back into groups, but I wanted you to just think about what I love about the clips is not just, yes, you see the way the young folks are engaged, right? That's beautiful. But what I love is the kinds of relationships that the teachers are forming with the students. One that's rooted both in trying to develop authentic relationships with the students in their communities. And that is paired with, by the way, academic rigor, right? So let me just make this point clear, right? That the kinds of relationships that I'm going to be calling for aren't a move away from dealing with academic rigor. It's trying to develop the kind of relationships that will get your students to be motivated to be involved in that academic rigor. I hope that makes sense, right? Paulo Freire says that in Paulo Freire's sense of teaching, the teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but is the one who, one is themselves taught in dialogue with students who in turn, while being taught, also teach, right? I'm talking about this note, and right, they become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments are based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that your authority as an educator needs to be rooted in helping your students achieve freedom, not a sense of authority that's rooted in showing the power and authority that you have over them, right? That you need to be learning from them so that you can better teach them. I hope that makes sense. So it's this notion of personal authority over positional authority, right? You want to build authentic relationships with students so that you can position yourself to have the trust of your students to engage on that learning journey. That's going to be, could be hard, right? It positions yourself to understand the needs and strengths of your students as you engage in this work. And then most importantly, as we saw with those young folks, right? It positions your students to be motivated to meet the high levels of academic rigor. And what you saw, and what you see in this movie is that students in a school where, almost 70 or 80% of the Mexican and American students were dropping out, this program was having 90% of the students get into college. Part of what you need to do as an educator is to reflect on your own positionality. I wanted to share a few things we saw from the research that we display in our book, Schooling for Critical Consciousness. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm just going to give you 3 quick examples. This is an example of a teacher who was a white man teaching an African-American literature course, who basically his class was predominantly Black students, asked him to change the way he was teaching, especially teaching the texts, because they felt that he was teaching it through the lens of his white kind of identity and not really giving the students an opportunity to explain and see it through their own eyes and their own experiences. And he ended up changing the way he taught. He was able to receive that feedback and change the way he taught. And we get Melissa down here, really showing us the way that she and the other students appreciated the way that he did change, right, because of this. And what that speaks to is the teacher being able to reflect on his own positionality, his own identity, sit with that discomfort, listen to his students, learn from them, right, and then make a course correction. Okay, so reflecting on your own positionality, right? Bell Hooks talks about this notions of teachers taking risks and sharing their own confessional narratives, that if we expect students to do the same thing. So part of this will be for you, both privately and maybe publicly, to reflect on your positionality so that you can get your students to do the same, right? And it'll help in addition, that's what I'm saying here. And in addition to reflecting on issues of race, gender, and sexuality, you also need to think about notions of adult youth power dynamics as well. So that's that piece about thinking about orienting yourself towards listening to your students and being in a reciprocal relationship. We want to pair the study of oppression with resistance, okay? So in other words, we want to teach our young folks about the ways in which, different communities have been held down, but we also need to combine that with the study of the ways in which the folks resisted against that oppression. And it really is a way of showing all the beautiful things that folks create through the struggle of resistance. And it's an important thing. So I'm not going to read this quote, but this was an example of a student that we saw who was learning about the Haitian Revolution and how empowering it was for her to learn about that, right? And it's important because it helps teach about minority communities through the lens of strength and resilience. That's an important thing. Yes, we want them to learn about these issues, but we don't want them to just feel helpless and hopeless, right? We want them to feel like, hey, people have done something about this, they can do something about this, and I'm part of that legacy, okay? So it'll help students develop critical hope and agency and stave off helplessness and hopelessness. These learning opportunities, as we saw in the movie clip, will help build students' will and their skills, right? We saw them developing academic skills, right? I would go to Dr. Sider's presentation if you want to see more of what that can look like. And it will help position students to develop strong positive identities, which is a key foundation for them to be able to be academically strong moving forward. And the last thing I'll say, because I've run way out of time here, I really apologize, is we need to scaffold authentic learning opportunities when students take action against inequity. So what happens is we teach students about inequities, and then what inevitably happens is they start to see them, both inside their schools and outside their schools, okay? And we saw one example of a school where which was sort of the bad example, where students, a key staff member was fired. Students saw this as the last straw and the lack of diversity in their school. They planned to walk out, they did it, and in the school, what did? They responded punitively. They locked them out. They didn't support them. they marked the maps and couldn't use the bathrooms, couldn't get school lunch. Not the way to do it, right? Not the way. We want to, yes, figure out the ways to keep our students safe while also seeing this as an important teaching opportunity. I think Dr. Williams drove that point home, right? So when students learn about these things, we expect them to see these things happening both inside and outside of schools. When students want to take action, we need to balance the need to ensure their safety with the need to help them develop key academic skills and civic skills. Students, the teacher's focus should really be on the student's skill and disposition development, right? As well as helping them contextualize the kind of work that they might want to do. And then you need to be clear with your students and yourself, right? About the values and ethics that inform what, why, and how you teach. So you have clarity for yourself and for them about why you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing in terms of helping them engage in said action. Hope that makes sense. I went way over time. I feel awful about that, but I'm gonna stop now to just see if folks have questions. I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see y'all. I feel really bad. I'm usually better at timing like this, but I know I have a few more minutes left, but I just wanna see if anybody has questions or comments. I would also suggest for those of you who are saying, yeah, this is great and all, but like, what do I teach, right? Like, how do we, what are the, that I would go to Dr. Sider's presentation next to get that set of information. But this was really just about thinking about, because I think a lot of teachers might want to do the kind of work of helping students understand these issues and do something about it. But if you don't have clarity about what is your role as a teacher in this kind of political work, right? And what does it mean for you and your particular identity to do work with your students, whatever their identities are, right? And what kind of relationships do you have with your students, right? If you're not thinking about those three things, all the great intentions that you have to do that kind of work could get bogged down because the students may not be either you're gonna face trepidation trying to do the work, right? Because you're not sure, is this what I'm supposed to be doing, right? Or the students, you might be super gung-ho about doing this work, but the students are looking at you like, who are you? And like, why are you trying to tell me this stuff, right? And so that's what I was trying to relay in this presentation, is the kind of orientation you need to do with yourself and then with your students, so that you can best then deliver the curriculum. The movie that we saw was called Precious Knowledge. If I can quickly do it, I will put it, for those of us who have access to Canopy, that streaming service, it's available on Canopy. If I can just find it real quick, I will. Well, yeah, I'm running out of time here, but those of you who are real, if you search either Canopy, the streaming web service, or I believe the Facing History and Ourselves also might have it there as well, if you're interested. But it's called Precious Knowledge. It's an amazing story. And if you're interested, I'm connected to a few of the educators. So if you're really interested in connecting with some of the educators, I can make that happen as well. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate your time, and have a great rest of your day. And I hope we see you for the rest of the conference.